The morning my son-in-law threw my late wife's ceramic bowl against the kitchen wall, I didn't say a word. I just watched the pieces scatter across the tile floor. The blue and white bowl Dorothy had brought back from a trip to Prince Edward Island 32 years ago, and I stood there with my coffee going cold in my hand, thinking, he has no idea what he just started. Let me back up a little. My name is Walter. I'm 67 years old. I spent 34 years running a small but steady accounting firm out of Guelph, Ontario. Nothing flashy. I handled books for local businesses, hardware stores, dental offices, a Havrio stores, dental offices, a few contractors. I built something honest, and when I retired 4 years ago, I had enough to live comfortably. The house Dorothy and I had paid off years before, a reasonable RRSP, and a daughter named Claire who I loved more than anything left in this world. Dorothy passed 6 years ago, ovarian cancer. We had 11 months from diagnosis to the end, and I spent every one of those months holding her hand, driving her to treatments at Juravinsky, making her soup she could barely eat. When she went, she took a large piece of me with her. I won't pretend otherwise. Claire was 26 when her mother died. She grieved hard, and she grieved in the arms of a man named Ryan, whom she had been dating for about 8 months at that point. I didn't know him well. He was polite enough at Dorothy's funeral, firm handshake, said the right things, helped stack the folding chairs afterward. I thought, he's decent. I thought, Claire could do worse. They were married 14 months later in a small ceremony at a vineyard, outside Niagara-on-the-Lake. I walked my daughter down the aisle on a warm September afternoon, and I thought about Dorothy the entire time and managed not to cry until I sat down in the front row and the music started again. I'm telling you this so you understand how much I loved my daughter, how much I wanted things to work for her. I was not looking for problems with Ryan. I was not one of those fathers who thinks no man is good enough. I wanted to believe in him because she believed in him, and for a while I did. The first year of their marriage they rented a condo in Hamilton. Ryan worked in commercial real estate, not sales, the financing side. He was always careful to clarify that distinction, as though it mattered greatly. Claire worked as a dental hygienist, a job she was good at and genuinely enjoyed. They seemed fine. I would drive over for Sunday dinners every few weeks and things seemed fine. Then the real estate market started doing what markets do, and Ryan's firm downsized, and he was among the people let go. He was out of work for 5 months. I know because Claire told me, and because during those 5 months, Ryan started calling me more often than he ever had, not to talk exactly, but to ask questions about my firm, about my retirement, about what I was doing with my savings. I answered honestly. I didn't think much of it at the time. He was a man in finance who was anxious about money, and I was the father-in-law who had some. I thought the interest was natural. When he found a new position, a smaller firm, lower salary, but still steady work, the call slowed down. I exhaled without realizing I'd been holding my breath. About a year after that, they asked if they could move in with me. The condo lease was up. The housing market in the Golden Horseshoe was what it was. You don't need me to tell you what trying to buy a house in that region looks like now. And they said it would only be for a year, maybe 18 months, just long enough to save for a proper down payment. Claire asked me over the phone, and her voice was careful and a little embarrassed, and I said yes before she finished the sentence. Of course I said yes. It was my daughter, so they moved into the house in Guelph, the house where Claire grew up. The house where her mother's garden still blooms every June without anyone tending it properly, because I've never had Dorothy's patience for that kind of thing, but I can't bring myself to let it go either. The first few months were actually good. We ate dinner together most nights. Claire would cook on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and I'd cook on Sundays, and Ryan would occasionally make his one signature dish, a pasta with Italian sausage he claimed was from his grandmother's recipe, and we'd sit around the table and it felt something like a family again. I hadn't realized how quiet the house had gotten until it was less quiet. Then things shifted. I can't point to one moment. It was gradual, the way temperature changes without you noticing until you realize you've been cold for some time. Ryan started making small comments about the house. The layout wasn't practical, the kitchen was inefficient, the finished basement was wasted space. At first these landed as casual observations, and I let them pass. Then they started coming with suggestions attached. You know, Walter, if you knocked out that wall between the kitchen and the dining room, this place would feel twice as big. I nodded. I didn't knock out the wall. He started using my home office. Just occasionally at first. The Wi-Fi is better in here, do you mind? I didn't mind. Then occasionally became regularly, and one afternoon I came in to find he'd rearranged my desk. My files, which I kept in a system that had worked for 34 years, had been stacked in a corner to make room for his second monitor. I put them back and said nothing. I didn't want to make it a thing. Claire seemed not to notice, or maybe she noticed and didn't know what to do. My daughter has her mother's warmth, but she has always struggled with confrontation. Dorothy used to say that Claire would apologize to a door she walked into. It was said with love. I mention it now because it matters. Ryan began to make it clear, in ways both direct and indirect, that he felt constrained living under someone else's roof. He said things like, "when we have our own place," in a tone that made it sound like an accusation. He said things like, "it's hard to really settle when nothing is yours." He said these things to Claire in the kitchen when he thought I was watching television in the next room. But the house is not large, and I have always had good hearing. About 8 months after they moved in, Ryan came to find me one Saturday morning, while Claire was at a spin class. He sat across from me at the kitchen table with the look of a man who has rehearsed something, and he said he wanted to talk to me about an opportunity. He had found a property, a 4-bedroom house in a newer subdivision out near Fergus. Hoot School District. For the future, he said, and gave me a meaningful look that I understood to mean Claire was pregnant or they were planning to be soon. The house was asking $780,000. With what they had saved, they were still well short of the down payment they needed to avoid a high-ratio mortgage and the CMHC insurance that comes with it. He thought, he said, that it might make sense for me to consider advancing Claire her inheritance early. Not the full amount, just enough to bridge the gap. He had looked at my house's estimated value, which he mentioned casually as though checking a weather forecast, and he said that given what I had in registered accounts plus the equity here, the sum he was describing would be, and I remember this word exactly, negligible to me. I looked at him across the kitchen table my wife had picked out at a shop on Speedvale Avenue 17 years ago, and I said I would think about it. He nodded. He seemed satisfied. I don't think he expected any resistance. I thought about it for 2 weeks. What I thought about mostly was the way he had phrased it, not as a request, but as a conclusion he had already reached, a calculation that was simply waiting on my signature. I thought about the rearranged desk. I thought about the wall he wanted to knock out. I thought about the way he lowered his voice when he was on work calls in my house, as though the content was something I shouldn't hear. I told him I wasn't comfortable advancing an inheritance at this time. I said it simply, without lengthy explanation, the way I had learned over decades of accounting to deliver news clients didn't want. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he was surprised, because he had expected more generosity from me given the situation. He said Claire was struggling living in a house full of her late mother's things. He said it as though he was delivering a fact, a piece of data, not as though he was twisting a knife with complete deliberateness. I said I understood his perspective, and that my answer remained the same. After that, things changed more quickly. He stopped joining us for Sunday dinners. When he was home, he was in the office or in their room. He spoke to me in the kitchen with the curt civility of a colleague he had been forced to share a workspace with. Claire grew quieter at meals, which told me the conversations in their room were not easy ones. I said nothing. I want to be clear about that. I made no accusations. I did not lecture my daughter. I did not go to her with a list of her husband's offences. I made Sunday dinners. I kept the house warm. I let things be what they were. About 3 weeks after I declined his proposal, I came home from lunch with my old partner Gerald to find that the framed photo of Dorothy and me at our 30th anniversary dinner, the one that sat on the small table in the hallway, the one Claire had given me as a Father's Day gift 2 years after her mother died, had been moved. It was face down on the table, as though it had been knocked over and no one had thought to pick it up. I set it upright. I said nothing. Then came the morning with the bowl. I was making oatmeal. The blue and white bowl was on the counter because I used it for fruit in the mornings. I had used it every morning since Claire and Ryan moved in, as I had used it for years before that. Ryan came into the kitchen in work clothes, clearly running late, opened the cupboard looking for something, and swept his arm across the counter with more force than necessary. The bowl went off the edge. It hit the floor and broke into 4 pieces. He looked at it. He looked at me. And then he said, without apology, without even a change in expression, "It was in the way." And he left. I stood there in the silence of my own kitchen, and I thought about Dorothy carrying that bowl home on the ferry from Wood Islands, tissue wrapped in her carry-on because she was afraid to put it in checked luggage. I thought about 32 years of fruit and salads and the way the light came through the kitchen window in the mornings and caught the blue in the glaze. I thought about my daughter upstairs, who had said nothing when the bowl hit the floor. And I thought, all right then. There is a man I've known for 26 years named Bernard Okafor. Bernie is a retired family law attorney who was a client of mine for 15 years before we became proper friends. The kind of friendship that develops over tax seasons and gradually becomes something that involves fishing trips up to Georgian Bay and calling each other on birthdays. His wife and Dorothy were fond of each other. He sat in the 3rd row at her funeral. I called Bernie that afternoon. I did not call him in anger. I was very calm. I explained the situation, the request for early inheritance, the decline, the change in atmosphere, the broken bowl, the larger pattern I had been watching develop for months. Bernie listened without interrupting, which is a quality I have always admired in him. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Walter, I think you need to get some things in order before this goes any further." I asked what he meant. He said he meant a lot of things. He said he meant I should talk to my own estate lawyer. He recommended one, a woman named Patricia Shields, who had an office in downtown Guelph, about reviewing my will and the specific language around conditional gifting. He said I should make sure my beneficiary designations on my RIFs and my insurance were current and explicit. He said I should make a clear inventory of assets. And he said, in the careful tone of a man choosing his words, if you have any concerns about pressure or undue influence, there are ways to document that. I spent the next 6 weeks being very quiet and very busy. I met with Patricia Shields twice. I made changes to documents that needed changing. I had a long conversation with my financial advisor at the credit union about account structures and what a formal gift versus a loan versus nothing at all looks like from a legal standpoint. I also, on Bernie's suggestion, kept notes, dates, times, specific words said. When Ryan commented that the house was too large for one person and that it made more sense financially for me to downsize and redirect the equity. When he mentioned, almost in passing, that he had a friend at a real estate brokerage who could give me a good valuation. When he suggested, with the patience of a man explaining something to someone slow, that holding on to the family home was an emotional decision rather than a financial one. I wrote it all down. I kept the notebook in my car. Claire and I had coffee together one Saturday morning in late February when Ryan was at a hockey game with colleagues. We didn't talk about Ryan. We talked about her mother, a little. We talked about how the garden would need to be divided and transplanted in the spring if the irises were going to survive. She told me she was 8 weeks pregnant. She cried when she said it, and I held her hand across the table, and I said I was so glad, because I was. I didn't say anything about her husband. I let that morning be what it was. In March, Ryan sat me down and made the request again. This time it was more explicit. He had numbers. He had a printed sheet from a mortgage calculator. He had a timeline. He said the Fergus house was no longer available, but he had found something comparable in Elora. He said the amount he needed was $240,000. He said he felt it was reasonable to expect that I would help my daughter and my coming grandchild secure a stable home. He said the word reasonable, the way some people use it as a pressure tool rather than a description. I listened to the entire presentation. I said I would need some time to consider. He said, "How much time, Walter? We've been here for almost 2 years." I said, "I'll let you know." What I knew, by that point, was that I had no intention of giving Ryan $240,000 or 240 cents, and that I had spent the last 2 months making certain my affairs were structured in a way that made any claim on my estate as difficult as possible. What I also knew was that I had a conversation to have with my daughter that I had been carefully preparing for, and that I wanted it to happen on my terms, in my time, with the right people present. I called Bernie again. I called Patricia Shields. I called Claire's aunt on Dorothy's side, Dorothy's younger sister Margot, who lives in Kingston, and to whom Claire has always been close. And I asked Margot if she would consider driving to Guelph the following Sunday for dinner. I told her it was important. She didn't ask many questions. Margot is a practical woman. I also called my son-in-law's mother. I want to pause here because I know that seems like an unexpected move. Ryan's mother, Diane, lives in Brantford. She is a retired school teacher. She and I had met at the wedding and at a few holidays, and we had always gotten along in the politely warm way you do with in-law family you see 3 times a year. I did not know her well, but she had called me twice in the past year, once at Christmas, once in the early spring, and both times she had said things that told me she was not unaware of who her son was. She had said once, "Ryan has always had difficulty separating what he wants from what he's actually owed." She had said it the way you say something you've been carrying for a long time. I told her what was happening. I told her calmly and without embellishment. She was quiet for a long while. Then she said, "What do you need from me?" I told her. The Sunday I am about to describe was the second weekend in April. The maples in the front yard were just beginning to bud. Claire had made a roast in the slow cooker, the way her mother used to, and the house smelled the way it used to smell on Sunday evenings when I had come home from a week of late-season tax work to find Dorothy in the kitchen with her sleeves rolled up. Margot arrived first at 4:30, and she and Claire had tea in the kitchen while I set the dining room table. Ryan was watching playoff hockey in the living room. The Leafs were doing what the Leafs always do, which is provide excellent practice in managing disappointment. He acknowledged Margot with a nod and went back to the television. Bernie arrived at 5 with his wife, Ruth. I had invited them for dinner, which was not unusual. Bernie and Ruth had been for dinner several times over the years. Ryan glanced at them from the living room, and his expression shifted in a way I noted, a recalculation. He had not known Bernie was coming, and he knew enough about my life to know who Bernie was. Diane arrived at 5:15. Ryan came out of the living room. He stood in the hallway and looked at his mother and then at me, and I watched the sequence of understanding move across his face. I said, "Ryan, let's sit down for dinner." He said, "What is this?" I said, "It's Sunday dinner." He said, "What is this?" I said, "It's Sunday dinner." Claire made a roast. We sat, all of us, at the dining room table with the good tablecloth Dorothy had kept for occasions. Claire looked uncertain. Reading the room, understanding that something had been arranged that she hadn't known about, Margot held her hand briefly. I let dinners start the way dinners start. I let people serve themselves. I let the first few minutes be ordinary. And then I said, I want to talk about a few things, and I want to talk about them with people I trust around the table. Ryan said, "Walter," I said, "please let me finish." And I did. I spoke clearly and without raising my voice, the way I have tried to do everything in my life since Dorothy taught me that steadiness is a form of strength. I talked about the pattern of the past 2 years. I talked about the requests, the pressure, the small erosions, the desk, the photograph, the bowl. I talked about what it had felt like to live in my own home and feel myself being managed, recategorized from a person into an obstacle. I talked about what I had decided to do in response. And I talked about the people now sitting at my table and why they were there. Bernie said a few things in his measured lawyer's way about what undue influence looks like and what documentation existed. Diane looked at her son and said, I told you this is not who we raised you to be." Ryan said nothing for a long time. Claire was crying quietly, not in collapse, in the way of someone who's been waiting for something to be spoken aloud for a long time and feels the complicated relief of it finally being said. Ryan left the table before dessert. He went upstairs. We heard briefly the sound of a bag being moved across the floor above us. I want to tell you that everything resolved cleanly and quickly from there, but I'm 67 years old and I know better than to expect life to be tidy. Ryan and Claire separated that spring. It was not easy, and it was not without pain. There was a pregnancy in the middle of it, and a baby girl born in October, whom I held in the delivery waiting room at Guelph General, shaking in the plastic chair. And when the nurse told me everything was fine, I put my face in my hands and said thank you out loud to no one in particular, or maybe to Dorothy. Her name is Vera. She has Dorothy's eyes, or maybe I am seeing what I want to see, but she has something around the eyes that makes me stop sometimes when I'm holding her. Claire lives in a rented townhouse 10 minutes from me. Ryan is elsewhere. That is as much as I will say about that. The legal arrangements around Vera were handled by people more qualified than me, and I will not speak to the details of those, except to say that my daughter has good people in her corner. I still make Sunday dinners. Claire brings Vera most weeks, and Margot comes down from Kingston every month or so. And Bernie and Ruth are there more often than not. The garden came back this June as it always does. The irises made it through the transplant. The blue and white bowl I glued back together. It sits on the counter in the mornings. The cracks are visible. I don't mind. There is something Dorothy would have appreciated about that, I think. The idea that a thing can be broken and mended and still be the thing it always was. I am not a man who believes in enemies. I am a man who believes in keeping records, calling your lawyer, and making sure the people who love you are sitting at the table when the important conversations happen. The rest takes care of itself in time. The bowl is still on my counter, glued back together, cracks visible in the morning light. Some people would have thrown it out. What's the point of keeping something broken? I kept it because it's honest. It shows exactly what happened, and that it survived anyway. I think that's worth something. I'd had a lot of time to think about that Sunday in April, the roast in the slow cooker, Margot driving up from Kingston, Bernie and Ruth at the table, Diane looking at her son with that quiet, exhausted sorrow that only a parent can carry. I didn't plan that evening out of spite. I want to be clear about that. Spite is loud and impatient, and what Ryan had been doing to my home, to my daughter, to the slow, steady erosion of my dignity, that required a response that was neither loud nor impatient. It required me to think clearly when every instinct said to react. That's the thing I keep coming back to. Ryan was not unintelligent. He was organized. He had numbers printed on sheets. He understood financing and leverage and how to frame a conversation so the other person feels like the unreasonable one. What he didn't have, what I don't think he ever developed, was the willingness to act according to something beyond his own immediate interest. He knew how to calculate. He didn't know how to be decent. And in the end, those two things are not interchangeable, no matter how convincingly you can dress one up as the other. I'm not someone who believes the universe is keeping score in any formal sense, but I do believe that the way you treat people, consistently, over time, especially when you think no one important is watching, shapes the life you end up living. Ryan treated my home like an asset to be acquired. He treated my grief like an inefficiency to be managed. He treated my daughter like someone whose loyalty he had already secured and therefore no longer needed to earn. And piece by piece those choices built something, not karma in any mystical sense, just consequences, plain and human and entirely predictable to anyone who was paying attention. What I'm proud of, and I don't say that lightly because I'm not a man who uses that word often, is that I didn't meet his worst with my own worst. I kept records. I called Patricia. I called Bernie. I made sure that when the moment came, it came with clarity and witnesses and no room for revision. That took patience that didn't always come naturally. There were mornings I woke up angry and had to make a deliberate choice to be steady instead. Steadiness, I found, is not a personality trait. It's a practice. You have to choose it over and over, especially when you're tired. Claire is doing well. Vera is almost 8 months old now, and has recently discovered that dropping things off her high chair tray is endlessly entertaining. I drove them to the conservation area last weekend, and we walked the trail along the river, and Claire held Vera on her hip and pointed at the ducks, and I thought, this is what was worth protecting. Not the house, not the RIF, not whatever figure Ryan had circled on his mortgage calculator. This A Sunday afternoon in October, my daughter laughing at a duck, my granddaughter grabbing at a leaf. That's the whole story, really. Everything else was just the work of making sure we got here.